Starting off, we have the lynching of Alexander Boyd. Eutaw, Alabama, 1870. The night of March 31st, 1870, didn't feel like a night that would rewrite the history of Greene County, Alabama. It was a Thursday, still quiet and heavy with the humid air of early spring. In the small town of Eutaw, the local hotel, the Cleary House, sat just off the town square. It was a modest place where travelers and locals alike could find a meal and a bed. On this particular night, one of its residents was a man named Alexander Boyd. Alexander Boyd wasn't just any citizen. He was the county solicitor, the equivalent of a modern-day district attorney. He was a man of the law, an official of the state, and in the volatile atmosphere of the Reconstruction-era South, he was also a marked man. As the clocks in town neared the midnight hour, the silence was shattered. The sound wasn't a single carriage or a lone traveler. It was the synchronized rhythm of dozens of horses. Eyewitnesses would later describe a sight that looked like a ghostly apparition emerging from the dark woods. Between 75 and 100 men, mounted on horseback and draped in white disguises, rode into the heart of Eutaw. They didn't move with the chaos of a mob. They moved with the chilling precision of a military unit. They surrounded the Cleary House. No one in the town moved to stop them. No windows flew open. No lanterns were lit in protest. The sheer scale of the force had paralyzed the village. The men dismounted, their heavy boots thumping against the wooden porch of the hotel. They knew exactly who they were looking for, and they knew exactly where he was sleeping. To understand why the county solicitor was being hunted by a mass cavalry in the dead of night, we have to look at the world Alexander Boyd lived in, a world where the line between law and lawlessness had almost entirely vanished. In 1870, Alabama was a powder keg. The Civil War had ended only 5 years prior, and the period known as Reconstruction was in full, turbulent swing. The old social order had been dismantled by federal force, and a new one was being built in its place, one that granted rights and political power to formerly enslaved people. For the white supremacist organizations growing in the shadows, like the Ku Klux Klan, this was an existential threat. Alexander Boyd was what many locals derisively called a scalawag, a white Southerner who supported the Reconstruction government and the Republican Party. To the men in white robes, Boyd wasn't just a political opponent. He was a traitor to his race and his region. But it wasn't just his politics that had put a target on his back. It was his insistence on doing his job. A few weeks before that March night, a prominent local figure and member of the Klan had been killed. In retaliation, several black citizens had been murdered in cold blood. Usually, in these times, such crimes against the black community were ignored by the legal system. But Alexander Boyd was different. He had publicly declared his intention to bring the killers to justice. He had been seen meeting with witnesses and was actively preparing to present evidence to a grand jury. He was attempting to use the law to break the cycle of vigilante violence. In the eyes of the Klan, the law was an obstacle that needed to be removed. Back at the Cleary House, the masked men didn't hesitate. They entered the hotel and moved toward the second floor. The proprietor, terrified and helpless, could do nothing but watch. They reached Boyd's room and hammered on the door. We don't know exactly what Alexander Boyd's final thoughts were. We don't know if he tried to plead for his life or if he met his fate with the stoic silence of a man who knew his time had come. What we do know is that the men broke into the room, seized him, and dragged him out into the hallway. There was no trial. There was no defense. There was only the brutal, efficient application of Southern justice as defined by the men in masks. They dragged Boyd out of the hotel and into the night air. Just a few yards away stood the courthouse, the very building where Boyd was supposed to seek justice for others. It was there, within sight of the seat of law, that the group opened fire. The sound of the volleys echoed through the empty streets of Eutaw. Alexander Boyd fell to the ground, his body riddled with bullets. But the attackers weren't finished with their message. They took his body and left it in a place where it couldn't be missed, a grim warning to anyone else who dared to use the legal system against the invisible empire. When the sun rose over Greene County the next morning, the town of Eutaw woke up to a nightmare. The body of the county solicitor lay in the dirt, and the men who had killed him had vanished back into the countryside. as if they were never there. The reaction from the state and federal government was, at first, one of outrage. Governor William H. Smith offered a reward for the capture of the perpetrators. There were calls for federal troops to intervene. To many in the North, the murder of Alexander Boyd was proof that the South was still in a state of rebellion, not with cannons and infantries, but with midnight raids and assassinations. However, the investigation quickly hit a wall of silence. This is the part of the story that is perhaps more chilling than the murder itself. In a town of hundreds of people, where nearly 100 men on horseback had ridden through the main square, no one saw anything. No one recognized a voice. No one could identify a horse. The wall of silence was a deliberate tactic. The members of the local community were either participants in the crime, sympathizers with the cause, or so utterly terrified of the Klan that they knew speaking out was a death sentence. The grand jury that Boyd had intended to use to prosecute others was now tasked with investigating his death. They called witnesses, they took depositions, and they ultimately concluded that they could find no evidence to indict a single person. The killers of Alexander Boyd walked free. They were the shopkeepers, the farmers, and perhaps even the neighbors of the man they had executed. The murder of Alexander Boyd wasn't just the death of one man. It was a turning point for the region. It signaled the total collapse of the rule of law in Greene County. If the state's own prosecutor could be gunned down in the middle of town with total impunity, then no one was safe. The message was received loud and clear. Political opposition to the white supremacist movement in the area effectively withered away. The voices calling for civil rights and equal protection under the law were silenced by the sound of that midnight volley. For decades, the story of Alexander Boyd was largely buried. It became one of those uncomfortable chapters of local history that people preferred to forget. It was categorized as unrest or troubles, sanitized of its political brutality. But the archives and the records of the Reconstruction era tell a different story. One of a man who believed that the law should apply to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the symbols on their robes, and paid the ultimate price for that belief. Today, the Cleary House is gone. The town square of Utah looks peaceful, a quintessential southern town with historic architecture and quiet charm. But if you stand near the site of the old courthouse at midnight, it's hard not to think about the sound of 100 horses and the man who waited in his room, listening to the hoofbeats get closer and closer. Alexander Boyd was a flawed man in a flawed time, but his death remains a stark reminder of what happens when a society allows the shadow of the mob to eclipse the light of the courtroom. It's a cold case not because we don't know who did it. In a broad sense, we know exactly who did it, but because the justice he sought for others was never granted to him. The dust eventually settled in Utah, and the Reconstruction era came to a close, giving way to the era of Jim Crow. The men who rode that night faded into the annals of local genealogy, their secrets kept until the grave. But the blood on the square that night in 1870 left a stain on the history of Alabama that no amount of time could ever truly wash away. Next story, the murder of Lord William Russell. London, 1840. The morning of May 6th, 1840, dawned with the kind of heavy, gray stillness that often blankets Mayfair before the city truly wakes. At number 14, Norfolk Street, the residence of Lord William Russell, the air was particularly quiet. Lord William was 73 years old, a member of one of England's most prestigious aristocratic families, and a man of predictable, quiet habits. He was the uncle of the sitting Secretary of State, Lord John Russell, and a fixture of the British establishment. His life was one of orderly comfort, maintained by a small, dedicated staff of servants. At approximately 6:30 a.m., Sarah Mansur, the housemaid, rose to begin her daily routine. As she descended the stairs to the lower floors, she noticed something that immediately felt wrong. Usually, the house remained sealed until she began her chores, but this morning, several items were out of place. In the back hallway, she found a warming pan and a set of silver spoons resting on the floor. Moving into the dining room, she saw that the cabinets had been forced open. Drawers were pulled out, and the glint of valuable silver was missing from its usual place. Panic began to set in. It looked like a burglary, a common enough occurrence in London, though rare in such a high-security neighborhood. Sarah hurried to wake the other servants. She called for the valet, Francois Benjamin Courvoisier, a 23-year-old Swiss man who had been in Lord William's service for only 5 months. Courvoisier appeared at his door, seemingly groggy and startled by the news. Together, along with the cook, they began to survey the damage. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Sarah noticed that the door to Lord William's bedroom was slightly ajar. It was a room that was never entered this early without a specific summons. Pushing the door open, the maid's scream shattered the morning silence. Lord William Russell was lying in his bed, the sheets saturated with crimson. His throat had been cut with such clinical precision and force that death would have been instantaneous. Strangely, a book was found resting on the bed beside him, a volume of the memoirs of Francois Vidocq, the famous French criminal turned detective. A pair of spectacles sat nearby, as if the elderly lord had been interrupted in the middle of a quiet evening read. When the Metropolitan Police arrived at the scene, they were met with a confusing tableau. On the surface, it was a robbery gone wrong. Valuable items were missing, and the house appeared to have been entered by force. However, as the investigators, led by Inspector Nicholas Pierce, began to look closer, the burglary started to look less like a crime of opportunity and more like a clumsy stage production. The back door showed signs of being broken into from the inside, not the outside. The scratches on the wood were consistent with someone trying to make it look like a forced entry. Furthermore, the valuable items that had been stolen weren't all gone. Many were found hidden in various locations throughout the house, under floorboards, behind skirting boards, and tucked into the back of cupboards. It was as if the thief hadn't had time to leave, or perhaps had never intended to. The focus of the investigation shifted almost immediately to the household staff. In the rigid class structure of Victorian England, the idea that a servant would raise a hand against their master was the ultimate betrayal, a violation of the social order that bordered on heresy. The police began a meticulous search of the servants' quarters. Suspicion naturally fell upon Courvoisier. He was the newest member of the staff, and his behavior during the initial discovery had been described by Sarah Mansur as strangely calm, almost detached. While the women of the house were hysterical, Courvoisier had moved with a mechanical precision. During a second, more thorough search of the pantry, which was Courvoisier's primary domain, Inspector Pierce discovered a loose piece of baseboard. Behind it, he found a gold locket and several rings belonging to Lord William. Even more damning, a search of Courvoisier's trunk revealed a pair of gloves stained with blood and a torn piece of cloth that matched a garment found in the master bedroom. Courvoisier was arrested and charged with the murder. The news sent shockwaves through London. This wasn't just a murder. It was a sensational event that pitted the upper crust of society against the dangerous classes of foreign servants. The trial, held at the Old Bailey in June 1840, became the spectacle of the season. The Duke of Sussex and other members of the nobility sat on the bench alongside the judges, a visual reminder of the victim's status. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, but it was powerful. They argued that Courvoisier, motivated by a mix of resentment and greed, had decided to rob his master. When Lord William caught him in the act, perhaps waking up to find his valet rifling through his drawers, Courvoisier panicked and committed the ultimate sin. The defense was led by Charles Phillips, a renowned orator of the day. Phillips fought a desperate battle, attempting to cast doubt on the maid, Sarah Mansur, suggesting that perhaps she or the cook had more to do with the crime than they let on. For the first 2 days of the trial, it seemed possible that Courvoisier might escape the gallows. The evidence was strong, but there was no smoking gun that proved he was the one who held the knife. Then, on the third day, the trial took a dramatic and unexpected turn. The proprietor of a hotel in Leicester Square, a woman named Madame Piolaine, came forward. She reported that a few weeks prior to the murder, a young man had left a large, heavy parcel with her for safekeeping. He had never returned for it. When she opened it after reading the newspaper accounts of the trial, She found it filled with silver plate engraved with the Russell family crest. She was brought into the courtroom and asked to identify the man who had left the package. Without hesitation, she pointed to Francois Benjamin Courvoisier. The defense was shattered. In a private consultation following this revelation, Courvoisier turned to his lawyer, Phillips, and whispered a chilling confession, "I have done it." This created a massive ethical dilemma for Phillips. Under the legal traditions of the time, he could not abandon his client, but he also could not lie to the court. He chose to continue the defense, but his closing argument was noticeably strained. He famously told the jury that God alone knew who committed the crime, even though he himself now knew the truth. Courvoisier's confession eventually became public knowledge. He explained that on the night of the murder, Lord William had rung his bell and reprimanded him for his performance. He had also discovered Courvoisier in the dining room late at night, where the valet was indeed preparing to steal silver. Lord William had threatened to fire him the next morning, knowing that a dismissal without a character, a letter of recommendation, would mean poverty and ruin. Courvoisier waited for the house to fall silent. He took a carving knife from the kitchen, crept into the darkened bedroom, and ended the life of the man he had served for 5 months. He then spent the next several hours staging the robbery, breaking the back door, and hiding the jewels he couldn't carry, hoping to lead the police to look for a phantom intruder. The jury took only 90 minutes to return a verdict of guilty. On July 6, 1840, a crowd of over 40,000 people gathered outside Newgate Prison. This was the era of public executions, events that drew people from all walks of life, from the poorest chimney sweeps to the wealthiest socialites. Among the crowd that day was the great novelist William Makepeace Thackeray, who later wrote a haunting essay titled Going to See a Man Hang, expressing his profound disgust for the spectacle. Also present was Charles Dickens, whose observations of the crowd's bloodlust would later influence his own social commentaries on the British justice system. Courvoisier ascended the scaffold with a firm step. He had spent his final days in prayer, reportedly showing deep remorse for his actions. As the hood was placed over his head, the roar of the crowd fell into a hushed, expectant silence. The bolt was drawn, and the life of the Swiss valet was extinguished. The murder of Lord William Russell remained one of the most talked about crimes of the 19th century. It wasn't just about the violence. It was about the vulnerability of the Victorian home. For the elite, the case was a terrifying reminder that the people they relied on to cook their meals, clean their clothes, and watch them while they slept were strangers with their own secrets and grievances. It also changed the way the public viewed the detective. The meticulous work of the Metropolitan Police in spotting the stage robbery and tracing the hidden silver showed the power of forensic logic over mere intuition. The case effectively ended the era of the gentlemanly crime and ushered in the age of the professional investigator. In the end, a few pieces of silver and a fear of losing a job led to the death of a nobleman and the execution of a young man far from home. The house at 14, Norfolk Street eventually returned to its quiet Mayfair rhythms, but the story of what happened in that upstairs bedroom on a gray May morning would haunt the London consciousness for generations to come. Next story, The First Fallen. New South Wales, Australia, 1925. The streets of Surrey Hills in the mid-1920s were not the trendy, gentrified avenues they are today. A century ago, this was the jagged, blackened heart of industrial Sydney. It was a place of smog, slum housing, and a violent undercurrent that the local authorities were struggling to keep at bay. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and stale beer, and the narrow laneways served as the primary arteries for a criminal underworld that was becoming increasingly bold. In 1925, the New South Wales police force was still navigating a post-war world, dealing with the rise of organized razor gangs and a public that often viewed the police with a mixture of fear and deep-seated suspicion. Into this volatile landscape stepped Edwin Shanahan. At 28 years old, Shanahan wasn't just another officer in a blue uniform. He was a man who seemed built for the era, physically imposing and possessing a reputation for being both fearless and fair. He had spent years walking the toughest beats in the city. He was a detective who knew the faces in the shadows, and more importantly, they knew him. But on the night of October 11th, the familiarity between the law and the lawless would reach a breaking point that would change the history of Australian policing forever. The evening began with a report of a stolen vehicle, a Buick, which in 1925 was a luxury few could afford and a prime target for the daring. The car had been taken from the city center, and word on the street suggested it was heading toward the industrial fringes of Surrey Hills. Shanahan, alongside his partner, Detective Senior Sergeant John Jack Miller, wasn't the type to wait for the car to come to them. They took to the streets, eyes peeled for the distinctive grille of the Buick through the dim, flickering glow of the gas lamps. As they neared the intersection of Fitzroy and Dowling Streets, they spotted it. The Buick was idling near the curb, its engine a low hum in the quiet night. Inside were several men, their silhouettes obscured by the shadows of the car's interior. For Shanahan, this was a routine encounter, a confrontation he had handled 100 times before. He signaled for Miller to cover the flank while he approached the driver's side. He had no way of knowing that the men inside weren't just petty car thieves. They were desperate, and one of them was carrying a weapon that he was far too eager to use. As Shanahan reached the door and identified himself, the atmosphere shifted instantly from a tense standoff to a lethal confrontation. Before he could even reach for his handcuffs or his own service weapon, a flash of light erupted from the darkness of the car's cabin. A single shot rang out, tearing through the silence of the neighborhood. The bullet struck Shanahan in the chest, the force of it throwing him backward onto the cobblestones. Miller rushed forward, his own heart hammering against his ribs as he saw his partner collapse. The Buick roared to life, tires screeching against the pavement as it tore away into the darkness, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a dying man. Miller knelt by Shanahan, calling his name, but the wound was catastrophic. Edwin Shanahan, the man who had survived the roughest alleys of Sydney, became the first New South Wales police officer to be murdered in the line of duty since the turn of the century. The news of the shooting ripped through the city like a wildfire. By the next morning, the murder of Detective Shanahan was the only thing anyone was talking about. For the police department, it wasn't just a loss, it was an insult. One of their finest had been struck down by motor bandits, a new breed of criminal that used the speed of the automobile to outrun the law. The pressure to find the killer was immense, coming from the highest levels of government, and a public that was suddenly gripped by a fear of rising lawlessness. The investigation centered quickly on a young man named James Big Jim Bruce. Bruce was well known to the Surrey Hills Police, a career criminal with a history of violence and a temperament that made him a loose cannon even among his peers. He was part of a circle that frequented the illegal drinking dens and gambling houses that peppered the district. Witnesses near the scene of the shooting described a man fitting Bruce's description fleeing the area shortly after the Buick was abandoned a few blocks away. The manhunt for Big Jim Bruce was one of the most intensive Sydney had ever seen. Detectives raided boarding houses, tore through warehouses, and leaned on every informant they had. The code of silence that usually protected the razor gangs began to crumble under the sheer weight of the police presence. No one wanted to be associated with a cop killer. The heat was too much, even for the most hardened criminals. A few days later, the net tightened. Acting on a tip, a squad of detectives descended on a small, nondescript house in the suburbs. They found Bruce hiding in a back room, looking nothing like the Big Jim of his reputation. He was disheveled, paranoid, and clearly aware that the game was up. He was taken into custody without further bloodshed, but the tension in the city didn't ease. If anything, it shifted toward the courtroom, where the public demanded justice for the fallen detective. The trial of James Bruce was a media sensation. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer who had no respect for human life or the authority of the state. They produced the weapon, a heavy-caliber revolver, and ballistic evidence that, while primitive by today's standards, was damning for the era. The defense tried to argue that the shooting was an accident, a reflex action in a moment of panic, or that Bruce wasn't even the one who pulled the trigger. But the testimony of Miller and other witnesses was insurmountable. As the jury deliberated, the city held its breath. This wasn't just about one man. It was about whether the law could protect those who enforced it. When the verdict came back, guilty of murder, there was a sense of grim satisfaction among the police ranks. Bruce was sentenced to death, the standard punishment for such a crime in 1925. However, the story of Edwin Shanahan didn't end with the closing of the cell door on James Bruce. His death became a catalyst for significant changes in how the Sydney police operated. Up until that point, many detectives went about their business unarmed or with outdated equipment. The realization that criminals were now using high-powered cars and modern firearms forced the department to modernize. It led to the formation of more specialized units and a push for better training in high-stakes confrontations. The funeral for Detective Shanahan was one of the largest the city had ever seen. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the procession. It was a sea of black hats and somber faces, a collective mourning for a man who represented the thin line between order and chaos. His colleagues carried his casket with a grim resolve, knowing that the streets they patrolled were now fundamentally different. The age of innocence, if such a thing ever existed in the slums of Surrey Hills, was officially over. In the decades that followed, Shanahan's name became a part of police lore. He was the first name on the modern remembrance wall, a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice. But for those who lived through the era, the memory was more visceral. It was the memory of a night when the darkness of the city felt a little more oppressive, and the sound of a distant car engine felt a little more threatening. The Buick, once a symbol of progress and wealth, had become a getaway vehicle for a murderer. The streets of Fitzroy and Dowling, once just another part of a beat, became a landmark of tragedy. James Bruce eventually had his sentence commuted to life in prison, a move that sparked its own controversy, but he would never again walk the streets of Sydney as a free man. He became a ghost of the system, while Shanahan became a legend of the force. When we look back at the case of Edwin Shanahan, it serves as a stark reminder of the transition period in criminal history. It was the moment the old world of foot chases and shadows met the new world of internal combustion and rapid-fire weaponry. It was a case that defined a generation of law enforcement and set the tone for the violent razor years that would follow in the late 1920s and 30s. The murder of Edwin Shanahan remains a cornerstone of Australian true crime, not just because of the act itself, but because of what it did to the soul of the city. It proved that no one was untouchable, and that the cost of peace was often paid in blood. As the gas lamps were eventually replaced by electric lights, and the horses gave way to fleets of patrol cars, the story of the detective who stepped into the path of a stolen Buick stayed etched in the pavement of Surrey Hills. Today, the intersection where he fell is quiet, occupied by modern apartments and cafes. There are no echoes of the gunshot or the screeching tires, but for those who know the history, the air still feels a little different there. It's a place where duty met desperation, and where a young detective gave everything he had to a city that was still learning how to protect itself. Next story, the Euston Square Mystery. London, England, 1879. In the late 19th century, London was a city of sharp contrasts. Beneath the veneer of Victorian propriety and the bustling progress of the industrial age, there lay a labyrinth of fog-choked alleys and secrets buried behind heavy oak doors. On May 9th, 1879, one of those secrets would literally be unearthed at number 4, Euston Square, a respectable 4-story lodging house. It was a discovery that would transfix the public, baffle Scotland Yard, and pull back the curtain on a household where nothing was as it seemed. The day began ordinarily enough. Mrs. Maria Bastendorf, the mistress of the house, had hired a laborer to clear out a coal cellar located under the front pavement. It was a dark, cramped space, long neglected. As the man swung his pick into the grime and accumulated debris of years, he struck something that wasn't coal. He cleared away the soot and found a bundle wrapped in decaying American cloth. When the layers were peeled back, the grisly reality was revealed. The skeletal remains of a woman, mummified by the dry air and cold dust, her features frozen in a silent scream. Around her neck, pulled tight with a finality that left no room for doubt, was a piece of hempen cord. This was not a natural death. This was a cold, calculated disposal. When the police arrived, they found a body that was little more than skin and bone, yet remarkably preserved. The medical examiner determined the victim was a woman of about 5'8", likely in her 30s. She was still wearing the remnants of a fine silk dress and expensive boots, the attire of someone who belonged to the middle class, not the destitute who usually vanished into London shadows. The question immediately shifted from what happened to who was she. The investigation began with the residence of number 4, Euston Square. The house was a revolving door of boarders, but the Bastendorf family had lived there for years. Severin Bastendorf, a charcoal dealer, and his wife Maria were well regarded. Yet the discovery in their cellar brought a sudden, suffocating scrutiny to their lives. As detectives scoured the records and spoke to neighbors, a name began to surface, whispered by those who remembered a strange disappearance 2 years prior. Matilda Hacker. Miss Matilda Hacker was an eccentric woman of independent means. At 67 years old, she was known for her peculiar habits and her tendency to move frequently, often under the assumed name of Miss Hewish. In late 1877, she had checked into the Bastendorf's lodging house. She was a woman who guarded her privacy fiercely, carrying a significant amount of money and wearing jewelry that spoke of a comfortable life. However, on the morning of October 14, 1877, Matilda Hacker vanished. At the time, the Bastendorfs claimed she had simply left without paying her rent. They told neighbors she had run off after a disagreement. Because she was known to be transient and lacked close family who checked in on her, no one raised an alarm. No missing person report was filed. No search was conducted. She simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world, until a laborer's pickaxe found her under the coal. The identification of the body as Matilda Hacker was confirmed by a few harrowing details. Though the face was unrecognizable, her height matched, and more tellingly, the boots found on the corpse were identified by a local cobbler who had repaired them for Miss Hacker just days before she disappeared. But the most damning evidence was a set of glass beads and a distinctive watch chain found near the remains, items that former servants remembered the elderly lady wearing. With the victim identified, the police turned their gaze toward the motive. Why would someone kill a lonely, elderly boarder? The answer, as it so often is, was greed. Matilda was known to carry a large sum of gold and banknotes. Following her disappearance, her belongings, including her furniture and clothing, had been sold or distributed. The Bastendorfs claimed she had left them as payment for her arrears, but the math didn't add up. However, as the detectives dug deeper, the focus shifted away from the landlords and toward a woman who had been a servant in the house at the time, Hannah Dobbs. Hannah Dobbs was 24 years old, described as sharp-witted and perhaps a bit too comfortable in her employer's home. She had been the one primarily responsible for attending to Miss Hacker during her stay. When questioned, Hannah's story was a web of contradictions. Even more suspicious was the sudden change in her wardrobe after October 1877. A girl on a servant's wage was suddenly seen wearing silk dresses and carrying a gold watch, the very watch that matched the description of the one Matilda Hacker had owned. The case against Hannah Dobbs began to solidify when a local pawnbroker came forward. He identified Hannah as the woman who had pawned several items of jewelry belonging to the deceased woman shortly after her disappearance. When police searched Hannah's current residence, they found more of Matilda's property. The trial of Hannah Dobbs in July 1879 became a sensation. The courtroom was packed with onlookers eager to see this servant fiend who had allegedly strangled an old lady and stuffed her into a coal hole. The prosecution laid out a compelling narrative. Hannah, knowing the old woman was wealthy and isolated, had killed her in her bedroom, robbed her, and then moved the body to the cellar in the dead of night. They pointed to the pawn tickets and the stolen goods as the smoking gun. But Hannah Dobbs was not a woman who would go down without a fight. Her defense team took a daring and scandalous approach. They didn't just deny her guilt. They shifted the blame onto her former employer, Severin Bastendorf. Hannah took the stand and dropped a bombshell that shocked Victorian sensibilities. She claimed she had been having an affair with Severin Bastendorf. She alleged that on the day Miss Hacker disappeared, she had seen Severin coming out of the elderly woman's room looking disheveled and panicked. She claimed he had told her that the old woman had died suddenly and that he needed help hiding the body to avoid a scandal that would ruin his business and his marriage. According to Hannah, she only helped him dispose of the body and took the jewelry as hush money to keep his secret. The courtroom erupted. Severin Bastendorf vehemently denied the affair and the accusation of murder. He painted Hannah as a thief and a liar who was trying to save her own neck by destroying his reputation. The prosecution argued that Hannah's story was a desperate fabrication, noting that a petite woman could have easily overpowered the frail Matilda Hacker, whereas a man of Severin's stature would have had no reason to involve a servant in such a grisly task. However, the defense had a powerful tool: the lack of physical evidence linking the act of killing to Hannah specifically. While she clearly possessed the stolen items that proved she was a thief, but did it prove she was a murderer? In the Victorian legal system, the burden of proof for a capital offense was high. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. To the shock of many in the gallery, they returned a verdict of not guilty. The reasoning was complex. The jury felt that while Hannah Dobbs was almost certainly involved in the robbery and the cover-up, the prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had been the one to pull the cord tight around Matilda Hacker's neck. The defense's suggestion of the landlord's involvement had cast just enough shadow over the case to make a conviction impossible. Hannah Dobbs walked out of the Old Bailey a free woman, though she was immediately arrested for the theft of the items she had pawned. She served a short sentence for the larceny, but she escaped the gallows. The not guilty verdict did not mean the case was solved. It meant it was effectively dead. Severin Bastendorf's reputation was in tatters. Though he was never charged with the murder, the public largely believed Hannah's story about the affair and his complicity. His business failed, and his name became synonymous with the mystery of Euston Square. As for Matilda Hacker, her remains were finally given a proper burial, far from the dark, soot-filled cellar where she had lain forgotten for nearly 2 years. The Euston Square mystery remains one of the most haunting cold cases of the 19th century. Next story: the murder of Martin DeFore. Fulton County, Georgia, 1879. The foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the late 19th century were a place of deep shadows and even deeper silences. In 1879, the city of Atlanta was beginning to rise from the ashes of the Civil War, transforming into a bustling rail hub, but just a few miles outside the city limits. Life remained rural, isolated, and governed by the rising and setting of the sun. It was here, along the banks of the Chattahoochee River, that a pioneer of the region lived out his final days. Martin DeFore was a man who had seen the world change around him. At 85 years old, he was a vestige of an older Georgia, a respected patriarch who had spent decades tilling the red clay and building a life for his family. He lived in a modest farmhouse with his wife, Susan, who was nearly 80 herself. They were the kind of couple who were synonymous with the land they occupied. In fact, the road leading to their property still bears their name today, DeFore Ferry Road. But on the morning of July 26, 1879, the peace of that farmhouse was shattered by a discovery so gruesome, so inexplicable, that would haunt the collective memory of Atlanta for generations. The day began like any other for the DeFore's grandson, who lived nearby. He had made it a habit to check on his grandparents every morning, a necessary precaution given their advanced ages. As he walked up the path toward the house, he noticed something unusual. The house was deathly still. Usually, by this hour, the smoke would be curling from the chimney and Martin would be seen tending to the livestock or sitting on the porch. Instead, the doors were closed, and the only sound was the wind through the trees. He stepped onto the porch and pushed open the front door. The interior of the cabin was dark, the air heavy and metallic. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw them. Martin and Susan DeFore were lying on the floor of their bedroom. It wasn't just that they were dead, it was the manner in which they had been taken. The scene was described by later investigators as a slaughterhouse. Both had been attacked with an axe, an implement that belonged to the farm itself. Martin had been struck with such force that his skull was shattered, and Susan had met a similar, violent end. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that they had even been able to lift a hand to defend themselves. They had been killed in their sleep, or perhaps just as they were waking, by someone who moved with the silence of a ghost and the brutality of a monster. When the news reached Atlanta, it sent a shockwave through the community. This wasn't just a murder, it was a violation of the social order. The Dufours were elderly, defenseless, and well-regarded. If they weren't safe in their own beds, miles from the supposed dangers of the city, then no one was. The initial investigation was a frantic, disorganized affair. In 1879, forensic science was practically non-existent. There are no fingerprint analyses, no DNA swabs, no high-tech reconstructions. Detectives relied on footprints, witness testimony, and a primitive understanding of psychology. The first thing they looked for was a motive. Naturally, they assumed it was a robbery. Martin Dufour was known to be a man of means, a landowner whom many suspected kept a stash of gold or cash hidden somewhere on the property. However, when the house was searched, nothing appeared to be missing. Silverware sat untouched. Martin's pocket watch was still on the bedside table. If money was the goal, the killer hadn't found it. Or perhaps, money wasn't the goal at all. This lack of a clear motive made the crime even more terrifying. It suggested a level of nihilism that the public wasn't prepared to face. Rumors began to swirl through the dirt streets of Fulton County. Some blamed itinerant workers passing through the rail lines. Others whispered about old blood feuds dating back to the war. The local authorities, under immense pressure to find a culprit, began a dragnet of the surrounding woods and settlements. The first person to fall under suspicion was a local man who had been seen wandering near the Dufour property the evening before the murders. He was a laborer with no steady home, making him an easy target for suspicion. He was brought in for questioning, his clothes searched for bloodstains, his alibi picked apart by aggressive prosecutors. But the evidence simply wasn't there. He had been miles away by the time the coroner estimated the deaths had occurred. He was released, and the trail went cold as quickly as it had heated up. As weeks turned into months, the Dufour murder became a dark legend. It was the unsolvable case. The farmhouse, once a symbol of pioneer success, became a place of dread. People claimed they could see lights flickering in the windows at night, or hear the sound of an axe striking wood echoing from the riverbank. The family eventually moved away, unable to bear the weight of the tragedy, and the property was sold, but the stain of that July night remained. However, the story didn't end with the closing of the initial investigation. Years later, a series of strange developments would reignite interest in the Dufour case, suggesting that the killer might have been much closer than anyone realized. In the early 1880s, a man was arrested in a neighboring county for a separate, violent assault. While in custody, he reportedly began to brag to his cellmates about a job he had done in Fulton County. He spoke of an old man and an old woman and an axe. Word of this jailhouse confession reached the Atlanta police, who sent a team to interview him. But when they arrived, the man recanted everything, claiming he was merely trying to build a reputation for toughness among the other inmates. Without physical evidence or a corroborating witness, the lead withered away. Then, there was the theory of the silent intruder. Some investigators began to look at the geometry of the house and the nature of the wounds. They argued that the killer must have been someone intimately familiar with the layout of the Dufour home. The doors hadn't been forced, the dog hadn't barked. This led to the chilling possibility that the murderer was a friend, a neighbor, or even a distant relative. But in a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, the idea of a wolf in sheep's clothing was almost too much to handle. Decades passed, and the case transitioned from a news item to a historical mystery. In the early 20th century, historians and amateur sleuths began to re-examine the files, noting similarities between the Dufour murders and other axe-related crimes that occurred across the South during that era. Was it possible that the Dufours were the early victims of a serial offender? The axeman archetype was a recurring nightmare in the post-Reconstruction South. often targeting isolated families in their sleep. The sheer brutality, the overkill as modern profilers would call it, suggested a perpetrator who was either fueled by intense personal hatred or someone who derived a sick satisfaction from the act itself. If it was personal, the secret died with the killer. If it was the work of a wandering predator, the Dufours were simply the victims of geography and timing. Today, the site of the Dufour farmhouse is unrecognizable. The rural landscape has been swallowed by the urban sprawl of Atlanta. Cars rush down Dufour Ferry Road, drivers likely unaware of the horror that took place just a few yards from the asphalt over a century ago. The grave of Martin and Susan Dufour sits in a quiet cemetery, their headstones weathered by time, the inscriptions fading into the gray stone. The case remains officially unsolved. It stands as one of the oldest cold cases in Georgia's history, a grim reminder of a time when justice was often outpaced by the darkness of the human heart. There are no more witnesses to interview, no more evidence to test. There's only the story. An elderly couple, a quiet night by the river, and the sudden, violent end of a pioneer legacy. Whenever people talk about the ghosts of Atlanta, they often start with the Civil War. But for those who know the deeper history of the city, the real shadows begin in 1879 in a small house on a hill where the silence was broken by the sound of an axe. The Dufour murders serve as a haunting prologue to the modern era of crime, a mystery that survived the transition from the horse and buggy to the digital age, remaining as cold and impenetrable as the river water that flows past the old ferry. Crossing. The questions still linger. Who could have harbored such malice against a pair of octogenarians? Why leave the valuables behind? And how did a killer vanish into the Georgia night without leaving a single footprint that led to the truth? We may never have the answers, but the name Dufour remains etched into the map of the city, a permanent marker of a tragedy that refused to be forgotten. Next story, the assassination of T.C. Heinemann. Helena, Arkansas, 1868. The Mississippi River town of Helena, Arkansas, in the late 1860s was a place of thick humidity, shifting loyalties, and a silence that felt heavy with the weight of the recent Civil War. And on the night of September 27, 1868, that silence was shattered by the blast of a double-barreled shotgun. The target was a man who had lived his life in the center of the storm, a man who had commanded thousands but could not protect himself in the sanctuary of his own parlor. His name was Thomas Carmichael. Heinemann, a former Confederate major general, a firebrand politician, and a man who had made more enemies than the muddy banks of the Mississippi had leeches. To understand why someone wanted T.C. Heinemann dead, you have to understand the man himself. He was not a person of half measures. Standing only 5 feet tall, Heinemann was a Napoleon of the South, aggressive, fiercely intelligent, and possessed of a temper that burned like white phosphorus. Before the war, he had been a rising star in the Democratic Party, a man who fought duels to settle political scores and once survived an assassination attempt in the streets of Helena by sheer force of will and a steady hand on his own pistol. When the war broke out, Heinemann didn't just join, he dominated. As a commander in the Trans-Mississippi Department, he was credited with saving Arkansas from immediate Union occupation, but he did so through a reign of martial law so brutal it horrified even his own side. He seized supplies, burned cotton to keep it out of enemy hands, and executed deserters without a second thought. By the time the Confederacy collapsed, Heinemann was a man without a country and, quite literally, a man with a target on his back. He fled to Mexico to join a colony of ex-Confederates, waiting for the dust of Reconstruction to settle. But the siren call of Arkansas was too strong. In 1867, he returned to Helena, attempting to reclaim his life and his political influence. It was a different world he returned to. The old power structures were gone, replaced by the radical Republicans and a newly enfranchised population of former slaves. Heinemann, ever the agitator, began organizing the Democratic opposition. He was a master orator, and his speeches began to draw massive, heated crowds. He was preaching a return to the old order, and in the volatile climate of Reconstruction Arkansas, that was a dangerous game to play. On that final Sunday evening, The Heinemann household was deceptively peaceful. Thomas was sitting in his parlor, the warm night air drifting through the open windows. He was surrounded by his children, his wife Mary having passed away just a year prior. He was reading a newspaper, perhaps planning his next political move, when the curtains fluttered. Behind the glass of the window, the barrel of a shotgun was leveled at his back. Two blasts erupted in quick succession. The buckshot tore through the window pane and struck Heinemann in the jaw and throat. The force of the impact threw him from his chair. As his children screamed and the smell of gunpowder filled the room, the assassin vanished into the dark, wooded shadows of the Arkansas night. Heinemann didn't die instantly. In a display of the iron grit that had defined his life, he pulled himself up. Despite the catastrophic wounds to his face and neck, he walked to the front porch. He called out to his neighbors, not for help, but to make a statement. He knew his time was short. He reportedly told those who gathered that he forgave his killers, but he also urged his political followers to remain steadfast. He lingered for several hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, before finally succumbing to blood loss and shock in the early hours of the morning. The investigation that followed was, by any modern standard, a disaster. In 1868, Helena was a town divided by race, politics, and lingering wartime grudges. The local authorities were seen as partisan, and many in the community believed the investigation was being intentionally stifled. There were three main theories that began to circulate through the hushed conversations on the street corners of Helena. The first, and perhaps most obvious, was political. Heinemann was the primary obstacle to the Republican administration in Arkansas. He was a man capable of swinging an election, a man who could incite a crowd to riot with a single speech. To the carpetbaggers and scalawags, as they were called, Heinemann was a ghost of the Confederacy that needed to be exorcised. Many believe the hit was ordered from the highest levels of the state government, a surgical strike to decapitate the Democratic opposition before the upcoming elections. The second theory was more personal. Heinemann's wartime record was written in blood. He had ordered the execution of many men for desertion or treason against the Confederacy. He had ruined families by seizing their crops and livestock. In the chaos of the post-war South, there were hundreds of men with a motive for revenge. Men who had spent years stewing in their hatred, waiting for the general to return to a place where he no longer had an army to protect him. This theory suggested a lone wolf, a veteran, or a grieving father, finally settling a decade-old debt. The third theory, and the one that often gets lost in the historical footnotes, involves a local feud. Heinemann had been involved in a bitter legal and personal dispute with a group of men over land and business interests in Helena. Just days before his death, he had been involved in a heated altercation in town. In a place where honor was often measured in lead, a private grudge was just as likely as a political conspiracy. Despite the high profile of the victim, no one was ever charged with the murder of T.C. Heinemann. There were whispers of names. Men like Rice, a local political rival, or others who had been seen near the house that night. But no arrests were made. The physical evidence was non-existent. The shotgun was never found. The footprints in the mud were washed away by the next rain. The assassination worked. With Heinemann gone, the Democratic Party in Arkansas lost its most charismatic and aggressive leader. The state remained under radical Republican control for years to follow. The silence that followed the gunshots that night in September became a permanent part of the Helena landscape. The case of T.C. Heinemann remains one of the great cold cases of American political history. It wasn't just a murder, it was a message. It was the final shot of a war that refused to end, fired through a window into a man's home. To this day, if you visit the cemetery in Helena where he is buried, you'll find a modest monument to a man who lived by the sword and, quite literally, died by the barrel of a gun. The identity of the person who pulled the trigger remains buried in the same Arkansas soil, a secret kept for over a century and a half by a town that preferred the silence of a grave to the truth of a crime. As we look back at the jagged edges of the Reconstruction era, the Heinemann assassination serves as a grim reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization can be when political passions and old wounds collide. It was a time when the law was often what you could get away with. and justice was a concept defined by the winner of the last fight. Thomas Heinemann spent his life fighting for a cause that failed, and in the end, he was claimed by the very violence he had so often wielded against others. The man who wouldn't be silenced in life was finally hushed by a coward in the dark, leaving behind a mystery that continues to haunt the history of the American South. Next story, the murder of Sharon Tyndall. Springfield, Illinois, 1871. The night of April 11th, 1871, was heavy with the kind of oppressive humidity that precedes a Midwestern storm. In Springfield, Illinois, the streets were mostly empty by midnight. The gas lamps flickered against the damp pavement, casting long, distorted shadows against the brick facades of a city that was still mourning the loss of its favorite son, Abraham Lincoln, only 6 years prior. But on this night, a new tragedy was about to unfold, one that would involve high-stakes politics, a desperate struggle for life, and a mystery that would linger in the archives of Illinois history for over a century. Sharon Tyndall was not a man of small reputation. He was the former Secretary of State for Illinois, a man who had walked the halls of power and helped navigate the state through the tumultuous years of the Civil War. At 55 years old, he was a respected figure, known for his intellect and his dedication to public service. After leaving office, he had remained in Springfield, residing in a comfortable home on East Adams Street. He was a man of habit, a man of stature, and, as it would turn out, a man with a target on his back. Shortly after midnight, Tyndall was walking home. He had spent the evening out, likely engaged in the kind of political or social discourse that defined his life. As he approached his residence, the quiet of the night was shattered. From the darkness of an alleyway, figures emerged. We don't know exactly how many, but the struggle that followed suggested Tyndall didn't go down without a fight. He was a man of stout character, and when confronted by those who intended him harm, he resisted. Neighbors would later report hearing the sounds of a scuffle, the heavy thud of boots on the ground, the muffled cries of a man fighting for his breath. Then came the sound that changed everything, a single, sharp crack of a pistol. The bullet struck Tyndall in the side, piercing vital organs. He collapsed onto the sidewalk, his life's blood pooling on the cold stone. The attackers didn't linger. They vanished into the labyrinth of Springfield's nighttime streets, leaving the former Secretary of State to die alone under the dim glow of a street lamp. When help finally arrived, it was too late. Tyndall was transported to his home, where he succumbed to his wounds within the hour. The news hit Springfield like a physical blow. A man of his standing, murdered in cold blood just steps from his front door? It was unthinkable. The police were immediately under immense pressure. This wasn't just a random mugging. It felt like a statement. The initial investigation focused on the most obvious motive, robbery. Tyndall was a man of means, and it was widely known that he often carried significant sums of money. When his body was searched, his gold watch was missing, as was his wallet. On the surface, it looked like a street robbery gone wrong. A prominent man targeted for his wealth, resisting his attackers and paying the ultimate price. But as the detectives began to dig deeper, the robbery motive started to feel a little too convenient. Why would a common thief target a man as well known as Tyndall so close to his home? And why kill him? Usually, in those days, a blow to the head with a slung shot, a weighted club, was the preferred method for street thugs. A gunshot was loud, it drew attention, and it brought the kind of heat no petty criminal wanted. Whispers began to circulate through the parlors and saloons of Springfield. Tyndall had enemies. In the world of Illinois politics, you didn't reach the level of Secretary of State without stepping on a few toes. There were rumors of financial discrepancies during his time in office, whispers of missing funds, and political favors that had gone unreturned. Could this have been an assassination disguised as a robbery? The investigators turned their attention to the Springfield Ring, a loose collection of political operatives and businessmen who were known to exert influence over the city's affairs. Tyndall had been a reformer, a man who had tried to clean up some of the corruption that plagued the state government. Had he finally pushed too far? Had he discovered something that someone was willing to kill to keep quiet? The search for the killers was exhaustive. Rewards were posted, and the city's finest detectives were put on the case. They rounded up the usual suspects, local toughs, known thieves, and those with a history of violence. But the leads were thin, witnesses were scarce, and those who had heard the struggle were unable to provide any descriptions of the attackers. It was as if the killers had simply dissolved into the Illinois mist. Months turned into years, and the case of Sharon Tyndall's murder began to grow cold. The initial outrage faded, replaced by the mundane concerns of a growing city. But for the Tyndall family and those who knew him, the lack of closure was a wound that refused to heal. They didn't believe it was a simple robbery. They believed there was a conspiracy at play, one that reached into the highest levels of Springfield society. In the late 1870s, a glimmer of hope emerged. A career criminal, facing a long sentence for another crime, claimed to have information about the Tyndall murder. He pointed the finger at a group of professional cracksmen, or safe breakers, who had been active in the area at the time. He claimed they had been hired to neutralize Tyndall because he was preparing to testify in a high-profile corruption case. The police followed the lead, tracking down the men mentioned by the informant. One by one, they were brought in for questioning. But the stories didn't hold up. Alibis were provided, and the evidence was circumstantial at best. It seemed the informant was simply trying to trade a tall tale for a reduced sentence. The lead evaporated, leaving the investigators back at square one. As the decades passed, the murder of Sharon Tyndall became a piece of Springfield folklore, a ghost story told to newcomers about the dangers that once lurked in the city's shadows. The gold watch was never recovered, the wallet never resurfaced, and the identity of the person who pulled the trigger remained a secret, perhaps taken to the grave by the killers themselves. However, modern historians who have revisited the case point to a different possibility. At the time of his death, Tyndall was involved in a series of complex land deals and railroad investments. The post-Civil War era was a time of rampant speculation and cutthroat business practices. The railroads were the lifeblood of the country, and the men who controlled them were often more powerful than the politicians. If Tyndall had been standing in the way of a major development or had evidence of a massive fraud involving railroad bonds, he would have been a very dangerous man to certain powerful interests. In 1871, the line between organized crime and legitimate business was often blurred. A hired hit, staged to look like a botched robbery, would have been an effective way to remove a problem without drawing too much scrutiny to the real motive. The physical evidence from the crime scene was minimal by today's standards. There was no DNA testing, no ballistics database, no security cameras. All the police had was a spent bullet and the testimony of neighbors who heard a fight in the dark. Without a confession or a smoking gun, the case was virtually unsolvable. But the tragedy of Sharon Tyndall isn't just about the mystery of who killed him. It's about the loss of a man who represented an era of transition in American history. He was a man who had seen the country torn apart and had worked to put it back together. His death marked a shift in Springfield, a realization that even the most prominent citizens were not safe from the violence that simmered beneath the surface of the Gilded Age. Today, if you walk down East Adams Street in Springfield, there is little to remind you of what happened that humid April night. The city has changed, the buildings have been replaced, and the echoes of the scuffle have long since faded. But in the archives, the file on Sharon Tyndall remains open, a silent testament to a life cut short in a justice system that was unable to find the truth. Was it a simple robbery gone wrong, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was it a calculated political assassination, carried out by those who feared what Tyndall knew? The missing gold watch suggests one thing, while the political climate of 1871 suggests another. The death of a Secretary of State should have been the crime of the century. Instead, it became a cold case, a puzzle with missing pieces that we may never be able to find. Sharon Tyndall died, defending himself, fighting back against an unknown darkness. And while his killers may have escaped the law, the mystery of his final moments continues to haunt the history of Illinois, a reminder that some secrets are never meant to be told. As we look back at the evidence, one detail stands out. Tyndall was known to be a man of exceptional memory. He kept meticulous records, diaries, and ledgers. After his death, his family noted that several of his personal journals from his time as Secretary of State were missing from his home. They weren't taken during the struggle on the street. They were gone from his private study. This detail suggests that someone had access to his home, perhaps even before the murder took place. If the killers were looking for information, they might have realized that killing Tyndall wasn't enough. They had to erase the evidence he had gathered. The robbery on the street might have been the final act in a much larger operation to silence him completely. The story of Sharon Tyndall is a journey into the dark heart of post-war America. It's a story of greed, power, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their interests. It challenges the idea that history is always written by the winners, reminding us that sometimes the truth is buried along with the victims. In the end, we are left with the image of a man walking home through the Springfield night, a man who thought he was safe in the city he helped build. He was met by violence, he fought for his life, and he fell. The rain that followed that night washed the blood from the pavement, but it couldn't wash away the questions. Who killed Sharon Tyndall? Was it the desperate act of a common thief, or the cold-blooded decision of a political machine? We may never know for certain, but as long as his name is remembered, the search for the truth continues. The past has a way of holding on to its secrets, but every now and then, a light shines into the shadows, and we get a glimpse of what really happened. Until then, the case of the murdered Secretary of State remains one of Illinois' most enduring mysteries, a story of a high-profile life ended by a low-profile crime, leaving a legacy of unanswered questions that still resonate today. Next story, the Polaris Expedition poisoning. The Arctic Circle, 1871. The Arctic has always been a place where ambition goes to die. In the mid-19th century, it was the final frontier, a jagged, white wasteland that swallowed ships and men whole. But in 1871, a man named Charles Francis Hall believed he was the one destined to conquer it. He wasn't a sailor by trade. He was a businessman from Cincinnati who had become obsessed with the fate of the lost Franklin expedition. He had spent years living among the Inuit, learning their language and their survival techniques, convinced that the key to reaching the North Pole lay not in naval tradition, but in adaptation. When Hall secured the backing of President Ulysses S. Grant and a $50,000 grant from Congress, it seemed the stars had finally aligned. He was given a converted Navy tugboat, renamed the Polaris, and a hand-picked crew. But as the ship pulled away from the docks in New York, the seeds of a lethal conspiracy were already being sown. Because while Hall was a man of vision, he was also a man of intense, rigid discipline. And he was about to lead a crew that was divided by nationality, ego, and a growing, silent resentment. The tension on the Polaris began almost immediately. Hall's second-in-command was Budington, an experienced ice master who viewed Hall as an amateur and a nuisance. But the real friction existed between Hall and the ship's scientist, Dr. Emil Bessels. Bessels was a German academic, sophisticated and cold, who looked down on Hall's lack of formal education. To Bessels, Hall was a commoner playing at being an explorer. To Hall, Bessels was an insubordinate who threatened the chain of command. That be why the time the Polaris reached the upper reaches of Greenland, the atmosphere on board was as frigid as the air outside. They pushed further north than any Western ship had ever gone, reaching a record latitude of 82 degrees 11 minutes north. But the ice was closing in. As the winter of 1871 approached, the ship became trapped in the frozen grip of Thank God Harbor. They were stuck, and in the cramped, dark quarters of a ship buried in the ice. Hatred has a way of becoming concentrated in late October. Hall left the ship for a 2-week sledge journey to scout the path forward. When he returned on October 24th, he appeared to be in peak physical condition. He was energetic, successful, and ready to plan the next leg of the journey. He walked into the cabin, took off his heavy furs, and asked for a cup of coffee. Dr. Bessels was the one who provided it. Within half an hour of drinking that coffee, Charles Francis Hall was violently ill. It wasn't the slow decline of scurvy or the exhaustion of the trail. It was sudden. It was brutal. He began vomiting uncontrollably. His stomach was gripped by agonizing cramps. He fell into a state of delirium, his mind fracturing as his body rebelled. For the next 2 weeks, the captain of the Polaris lay in his bunk, fluctuating between terrifying hallucinations and moments of chilling lucidity. During those clear moments, Hall's suspicion turned into an accusation that echoed through the wooden hull of the ship. He pointed a trembling finger at Dr. Bessels. He refused to take any medicine the doctor offered, screaming that they were trying to kill him. He accused the officers of poisoning his coffee. He would only eat food prepared by his trusted Inuit friends, Joe and Hannah, but the damage was already done that on November 8, 1871, Charles Francis Hall died. The official report from Dr. Bessels was simple. The captain had suffered an apoplectic fit, a stroke. To the rest of the crew, it was a tragedy, but perhaps an expected one given the stresses of Arctic exploration. They buried Hall on the frozen shore, marking his grave with a simple wooden headboard. With their leader gone, the expedition fell into chaos. Budington, now in command, showed little interest in reaching the pole. He spent much of his time drinking the ship's supply of medicinal wine. The Polaris remained trapped for months. When the ice finally began to break up the following year, the ship was nearly crushed. In a moment of sheer panic during a midnight storm, half the crew, including the Inuit families, became separated from the ship while unloading supplies onto an ice floe. For 6 months, those 19 people drifted 1,500 miles on a disappearing slab of ice, surviving only through the incredible hunting skills of the Inuit, until they were miraculously rescued off the coast of Labrador. The Polaris itself fared little better. The remaining crew had to run the leaking ship aground and spend another winter in the Arctic before being rescued by a whaler. When the survivors finally returned to Washington, the Navy held an inquiry. The questions were pointed: why did Hall die so suddenly? Why was there such animosity between the men? Dr. Bessels defended himself with the poise of a man of science. He claimed Hall was elderly, stressed, and prone to outbursts. The Navy, wanting to avoid a scandal that would embarrass the government, accepted the natural causes explanation. The case was closed. Charles Francis Hall was left behind in the permafrost, a footnote in the history of failed expeditions. The mystery of the Polaris slept for nearly 100 years. It remained a story of what if until 1968, when a biographer named Chauncey Loomis traveled to the remote grave site in Greenland. He wasn't looking for a crime scene. He was looking for historical context. But because Hall had been buried in the permafrost, nature's most perfect freezer, his body was almost perfectly preserved. Loomis received permission to exhuming the body. When they lifted the lid of the coffin, they found Hall looking much as he did the day he died. His beard was intact. His features were recognizable. Loomis took samples of Hall's hair and fingernails back to a lab for forensic analysis. The results were explosive. The tests revealed that in the final 2 weeks of his life, Charles Francis Hall had been administered massive, lethal doses of arsenic. The concentrations were highest in the samples corresponding to the very end of his life, the period when he was under the medical care of Dr. Emil Bessels. The timeline was undeniable. The arsenic wasn't something Hall had been exposed to over a long period. It was a concentrated attack that began the moment he returned from his sledge journey. The very symptoms he displayed, the burning stomach, the intense thirst, the vomiting, and the neurological breakdown, were the textbook progression of acute arsenic poisoning. When we look back at the cabin of the Polaris, the motive becomes a dark spectrum of possibilities. Was it a clash of civilizations? Bessels, the elitist Prussian, may have felt that Hall was an obstacle to scientific progress, a man whose reckless desire to reach the pole would get them all killed. There were even whispers of a romantic rivalry. Both men were said to be fond of the same woman back in the States, though that remains in the realm of speculation. What we do know is that Hall knew. In his fevered, dying state, his delusions weren't delusions at all. He was watching his killer walk into his room every day, disguised as a healer. He died in a state of absolute terror, trapped in a wooden box in the middle of a frozen ocean, surrounded by men who either wanted him dead or were too afraid to stop at the doctor. Bessels never faced justice. He returned to Germany, his reputation largely intact, and died years later after his own house and laboratory burned down destroying many of his records. He took the secrets of those final nights at Thank God Harbor to his grave. Today, Charles Francis Hall still rests in the Greenland soil. He reached a record-breaking latitude, but he never saw the pole. He is remembered not just as an explorer, but as the victim of one of the most remote murders in human history. Next story, the murder of Benjamin Nathan. New York City, 1870. The summer of 1870 in Manhattan was a season of stifling heat and profound social division. The Gilded Age was beginning to stretch its golden limbs across the city, creating a landscape where the brownstones of Fifth Avenue stood as fortresses of respectability against the growing chaos of a rapidly industrializing metropolis. But on the night of July 28th, a storm broke over the city. Not just a literal thunderstorm that rattled the window panes, but a storm of violence that would shatter the illusions of the New York elite and leave the police department grappling with one of the most baffling locked-room mysteries in American history. Benjamin Nathan was the personification of the New York establishment. He was a wealthy stockbroker, a man of impeccable character, and a pillar of the Jewish community. As the vice president of the New York Stock Exchange and a director of numerous charities, his life was defined by order, philanthropy, and the quiet dignity of his home at 12 West 23rd Street. It was a grand residence, filled with the trappings of a life well lived, shared with his wife, several of his children, and a loyal staff of servants. On that Wednesday evening, the atmosphere in the Nathan household was unusually quiet. Benjamin's wife and several of their children were away at their summer home in Westchester, seeking relief from the city's humidity. Benjamin had remained in the city for business, accompanied by two of his adult sons, Frederick and Washington, and a small contingent of domestic staff. After a quiet dinner, Benjamin retired to his second-floor study, a room he often used as a bedroom during the summer months because it was cooler than the upper floors. Washington Nathan, a young man known more for his penchant for New York's nightlife than for his business acumen, spent the evening out on the town. He returned home late, around midnight, and claimed to have exchanged a few brief words with his father before retiring to his own room on the floor above. Frederick, too, was asleep in his quarters. The house fell into the heavy, expectant silence of a summer night, punctuated only by the distant rumble of a passing carriage or the intermittent crack of thunder. The silence was shattered just before dawn. At approximately 6 a.m., Washington Nathan came stumbling out of the front door of the mansion, his clothes disheveled, his face a mask of horror. He ran toward a nearby police officer, screaming that his father had been murdered. When the authorities entered the study at 12 West 23rd Street, they were met with a scene that defied the refined elegance of the neighborhood. Benjamin Nathan lay on the floor near the center of the room. He had been subjected to a level of violence that suggested a frenzied, almost personal rage. His skull had been fractured by multiple blows from a heavy instrument, and the walls and furniture were marked by the evidence of a desperate struggle. Blood was everywhere, on the expensive carpets, the upholstered chairs, and the heavy mahogany desk where Benjamin had likely been sitting when the attack began. Despite the brutality of the scene, the room remained an enigma. The windows were shut and bolted from the inside. The door to the hallway had been locked. It was a classic closed-door mystery, yet the victim was dead, and the weapon was nowhere to be found, at least not initially. As the New York Police Department descended upon the house, the investigation immediately turned inward. There was no sign of forced entry. The heavy iron safe in the room, which contained thousands of dollars in securities and cash, had been opened, but curiously, only a small amount of money and a few pieces of jewelry were missing. The bulk of the wealth remained untouched. This led investigators to a chilling conclusion. This wasn't a simple burglary gone wrong. This was an execution, or perhaps a confrontation that had spiraled into madness. The discovery of the murder weapon only deepened the mystery. Tucked away in a nearby sink in the hallway was a dog killer, a heavy iron rod with a turned end, typically used by city employees to dispatch stray animals. It was coated in blood and hair. How had such a crude, lowly tool found its way into one of the most prestigious homes in New York? And why would a professional thief carry such a cumbersome, recognizable instrument? Suspicion fell first and most heavily on Washington Nathan. In the eyes of the public and the press, he was the perfect antagonist. He was a man about town, a gambler who frequently frequented the less reputable corners of the city, and a man who was rumored to be deeply in debt. The motive seemed crystalline: a desperate son, a stern father refusing to fund a lifestyle of vice, and a midnight confrontation that ended in a fatal blow. Washington's behavior in the aftermath did little to help his case. He appeared erratic, and his timeline of the evening's events shifted under questioning. He claimed to have heard nothing during the night, despite the struggle in the room below him being so violent that it had overturned furniture. The dog killer weapon was also linked to him in the public imagination. Some whispered that he had acquired it during his nocturnal wanderings through the city's rougher wards. However, the forensic evidence of 1870 was primitive. There were no fingerprints to collect, no DNA to analyze. The police were forced to rely on circumstantial evidence and the testimonies of the household. Frederick Nathan, the other son, stood firmly by his brother, providing an alibi that placed Washington in his own room during the likely time of the murder. The servants, too, claimed to have heard nothing until Washington's panicked cries in the morning. The investigation soon branched out, looking into the possibility of an inside job involving the staff. William Kelly, a former footman who had been recently dismissed by Benjamin Nathan, became a person of interest. Kelly had a motive: revenge for his firing, and he was known to have a volatile temper. But Kelly had a solid alibi for the night of the murder, and no physical evidence linked him to the scene. As the weeks turned into months, the Nathan murder became a national obsession. It was the trial of the century before the century had even hit its stride. The newspapers, led by the sensationalist, yellow journalism of the era, printed every rumor and theory. Some suggested that Benjamin Nathan had been involved in secret business dealings that had turned sour. Others whispered of a secret life that the upright broker had kept hidden from his family. The most sensational theory involved a mysterious man in a gray suit who had supposedly been seen lurking near the Nathan residence on the night of the crime. This figure became a phantom of the New York streets, a symbol of the unknown danger that could penetrate even the most secure fortresses of wealth. But like so many leads in the case, the man in gray vanished into the fog of the city. The grand jury eventually took up the case, focusing primarily on Washington Nathan. The tension in the city was palpable. If a son of the elite could be indicted for parricide, it would signal a collapse of the very social order that Benjamin Nathan had represented. Yet, despite the intense pressure from the public and the police, the grand jury refused to indict. The evidence against Washington was deemed entirely circumstantial. There were no witnesses, no blood on his clothes that couldn't be explained by his discovery of the body, and no clear link between him and the dog killer weapon. The failure to secure an indictment sent the investigation into a tailspin. The police, embarrassed by their inability to solve a high-profile murder in a locked room, began to lash out. They arrested various drifters and known criminals, attempting to force confessions that never came. The Nathan family, meanwhile, retreated into a cocoon of grief and silence, their reputation forever tarnished by the shadow of the crime. As the years passed, the case grew cold, but the theories only grew more elaborate. Some historians and amateur sleuths later pointed toward a professional burglar named Billy the Kid, not the Western outlaw, but a notorious New York thief, who was known to use dog killers as tools for breaking and entering. The theory suggested that Billy had entered the house through a small, overlooked second-story window, was surprised by Benjamin Nathan, and committed the murder in a panic before fleeing with whatever he could grab. Another theory suggested a more complex conspiracy involving the Tammany Hall political machine. Benjamin Nathan had been a man of influence, and some believe his death was a political assassination disguised as a robbery. The dog killer, in this version of events, was a deliberate plant intended to lead the police toward the lower classes and away from the sophisticated orchestrators of the crime. But perhaps the most haunting possibility remains the one that the police first suspected: that the killer was someone already inside the house, someone who knew the layout, knew where the weapon was hidden, and knew exactly how to silence the patriarch of the family. The locked doors and windows suggest not a supernatural intruder, but a calculated intimacy. Today, the mansion at 12 West 23rd Street is gone, replaced by the shifting architecture of a modern city. But the ghost of Benjamin Nathan remains a fixture of New York lore. His death marked the end of an era of perceived safety for the city's upper class. It proved that wealth and status provided no shield against the darkness of human nature, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who share dinner tables. The murder of Benjamin Nathan remains officially unsolved. It sits in the archives of the NYPD as a testament to the limitations of 19th century justice and the enduring power of a well-kept secret. In the end, we are left only with the image of a blood-stained study, a discarded iron rod, and the silent cries of a man whose life was stolen in the heart of the city he helped build. The truth likely died with the people who were in the house that night, carried to their graves in the quiet cemeteries of New York, leaving us only with the echoes of a storm that never truly ended. Next story, the kidnapping of Charles Ross. Chicago, Illinois, 1937. The evening of September 25th, 1937, was meant to be the conclusion of a pleasant social visit for the Ross family. Charles Ross, a 72-year-old retired greeting card executive, was a man of routine and respectability. He had spent his life building a successful career, and now, in the twilight of his years, he enjoyed the fruits of that labor in the leafy, affluent suburb of Lake Bluff, just north of Chicago. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the driveway of his estate, Charles walked his guest, Florence Freeman, to her car. It was a simple, polite gesture, the kind of small act that had defined his character for decades. But as the cool autumn air settled over the grounds, the quiet of the suburban night was shattered. From the darkness, two men emerged. They didn't belong in Lake Bluff. They moved with a calculated, desperate energy that stood in stark contrast to the serenity of the neighborhood. Before Charles or Miss Freeman could react, they were confronted with the cold steel of a weapon. The attackers were efficient. They forced both Charles and Miss Freeman into the back of her own vehicle. The engine roared to life, and the car sped away, leaving the silent house behind. For miles, the vehicle navigated the winding roads of northern Illinois. The tension inside the car was suffocating. Miss Freeman, terrified and confused, tried to make sense of the nightmare. Charles, despite his age, remained stoic, though the gravity of the situation was becoming clear. This wasn't a random robbery. This was a targeted abduction. After a harrowing drive, the car pulled over on a desolate stretch of road near Wheeling, Illinois. The men ordered Miss Freeman out of the vehicle. They didn't harm her, but their message was clear. Stay here, don't move, and don't speak. They took Charles, moved him into another waiting vehicle, and disappeared into the blackness of the night. Florence Freeman was left alone in the dark, the sound of the receding engine the only thing breaking the silence. By the time she was able to find help and alert the authorities, the trail had already begun to go cold. The news of the kidnapping hit Chicago like a physical blow. In 1937, the memory of the Lindbergh tragedy was still fresh in the American psyche. Kidnapping was viewed as the ultimate violation of the social contract, a crime that didn't just target an individual, but the very idea of safety and domestic peace. The FBI, led by the indomitable J. Edgar Hoover, was immediately mobilized. The G-Men descended on Chicago, working alongside local law enforcement to track down the men who had snatched a prominent citizen from his own front yard. Within 48 hours, the first piece of the puzzle arrived. It was a ransom note delivered with the kind of chilling precision that suggested this wasn't the work of amateurs. The kidnappers demanded $50,000, a staggering sum during the tail end of the Great Depression. The instructions were complex, designed to run the family and the police in circles. Charles's wife, Annie Ross, was thrust into a position of unimaginable pressure. She was told to communicate through coded personal advertisements in the Chicago Tribune. The kidnappers used the pseudonym John Sutton, For weeks, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out in the classified sections of the newspaper. The family signaled their willingness to pay, pleading for proof of life, while the FBI monitored every letter, every phone call, and every lead with microscopic intensity. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence from the captors grew longer. The Ross family lived in a state of suspended animation, caught between hope and the creeping dread that Charles might never come home. Behind the scenes, the FBI was focusing on a specific profile. Kidnapping on this scale required logistics, a hideout, a getaway vehicle, and a level of coordination that usually left a paper trail. Investigators began canvassing every suspicious character in the Midwest, looking for anyone who had recently come into a sudden windfall or who had disappeared around the time of the abduction. Their attention eventually turned to a man named John Lachlan Checkley. Checkley was a career criminal with a history that suggested he was capable of exactly this kind of calculated cruelty. He wasn't alone. His associate, Albert Klein, was a man with a similarly shadowed past. The FBI began to tighten the noose, tracking the movements of these two men across state lines. The breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic shootout or a lucky break. It came from a meticulous, grinding work of analyzing the physical evidence. The ransom notes had been written on a specific type of paper, and the handwriting, though disguised, bore certain hallmarks that the Bureau's experts were beginning to recognize. While the search for the men intensified, the search for Charles Ross took a darker turn. Investigators were scouring the rural areas outside of Chicago, looking for any sign of a makeshift prison or, more grimly, a shallow grave. The optimism that had characterized the early days of the investigation was beginning to erode. 72 years old is a fragile age to endure the trauma of a kidnapping, the exposure to the elements, and the psychological toll of captivity. In January of 1938, months after the abduction, the FBI finally made their move. They apprehended Checkley and Klein. The interrogation rooms at the federal building in Chicago became the stage for a final confrontation. At first, the men were defiant. They denied any involvement, clinging to the hope that without a body, the state had no case. But the FBI had built a mountain of circumstantial evidence. They had tracked the purchase of the typewriter used for the notes. They had witnesses who placed the men near the Ross estate, and they had found remnants of the ransom preparations in a hideout used by the duo. Under the pressure of federal prosecution and the looming threat of the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a capital offense, the resolve of the suspects began to crumble. Eventually, the truth began to leak out, piece by agonizing piece. The story they told was one of cold-blooded opportunism. They had targeted Charles Ross because of his perceived wealth. They had watched him, learned his habits, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. But their plan had gone wrong almost immediately. According to the suspects, Charles hadn't been the compliant victim they expected. Despite his age, he had struggled. He had resisted. The kidnappers claimed that during the initial transport, Charles had suffered a medical emergency, likely a heart attack or a stroke brought on by the immense stress of the assault. They realized that their commodity was dying. Instead of seeking help or abandoning the plan, they made a horrific choice. They drove Charles to a remote, wooded area near Kankakee, Illinois. There, while he was still alive but fading, they ended his life. They didn't want to deal with a captive who required care, and they certainly didn't want a witness who could identify them. They buried him in a shallow grave, covered him with lime to accelerate decomposition, and then had the audacity to continue the ransom negotiations for months. They had been asking for $50,000 for a man they knew was already dead. The discovery of Charles Ross's remains was a somber conclusion to a case that had gripped the nation. When the authorities were led to the site in the frozen woods of Kankakee, the reality of the crime settled over the public. This wasn't just a theft, it was a betrayal of basic humanity. A man who had spent his life contributing to his community had been discarded like refuse by two men who saw him as nothing more than a payday. The trial of Checkley and Klein was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public's appetite for justice was voracious. Both men were convicted. In an era where the death penalty was the standard response to such heinous acts, They were sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that many felt was too lenient given the coldness of their actions. The Charles Ross kidnapping remains a landmark case in the history of American crime for several reasons. It showcased the growing sophistication of the FBI and their ability to use forensic science to solve complex abductions. It also served as a grim reminder of the snatch racket era, where wealthy individuals were seen as easy targets for desperate men. But beyond the legal and historical significance, the case is a haunting story of a family's shattered peace. For months, Annie Ross had lived on a diet of false hope, fueled by the lies of her husband's killers. She had placed those ads in the newspaper, believing that somewhere Charles was waiting for her to save him. The realization that he had been gone since the very first night was a cruelty that no amount of justice could ever truly rectify. Today, the name Charles Ross is often overshadowed by the larger-than-life crimes of the 1930s, the Capones, the Dillingers, and the Lindberghs. But his story is a vital chapter in understanding the darkness that can lurk just outside the gates of a quiet home. It is a story of a life stolen, a family deceived, and a city that had to confront the fact that even in the most secure neighborhoods, safety is often an illusion. As the wind blows through the trees in Lake Bluff today, the estate where Charles once lived stands as a silent witness to that September night in 1937. It serves as a reminder of the man who walked his guest to her car and never returned, and of the two men who believed they could profit from the destruction of a life, only to find that the weight of their crime would eventually bury them as well. Next story, the murder of Arthur St. Clair, San Jacinto County, Texas, 1877. The piney woods of East Texas are beautiful, but they are dense. In the late 19th century, they were more than just scenery. They were a labyrinth of shadows where a man could disappear and secrets could stay buried under layers of pine needles and red clay for generations. In 1877, San Jacinto County was a place of fragile peace and simmering tensions. The Civil War had ended little more than a decade prior, and the wounds of Reconstruction were still raw. In this volatile atmosphere, a man named Arthur St. Clair was trying to make a life that would eventually end in a way so brutal and so politically charged that it would haunt the local folklore for over 100 years. To understand the tragedy of Arthur St. Clair, you have to understand the man himself. He wasn't a native of the rough-and-tumble Texas backcountry. St. Clair was an outsider, a well-educated man of mixed heritage who had come to the county with ambitions that extended far beyond the cotton fields. He was a teacher, a community leader, and most significantly, a politician. In a time when the color of one's skin often dictated the ceiling of their potential, St. Clair had climbed remarkably high. He held the office of county commissioner, a position of genuine influence. But in the 1870s, in a South that was aggressively redeeming itself from the changes brought by the war, a person like St. Clair wasn't just a public servant. To some, he was a provocation. The air in Cold Spring, the county seat, was thick with more than just humidity in the summer of 1877. There was a palpable sense of unease. St. Clair had become a focal point for the frustrations of the local Democratic establishment, who saw the Republican-led local government as a remnant of an era they were desperate to put behind them. St. Clair was vocal, he was effective, and he was fearless. He championed the rights of the marginalized and used his platform to ensure that the law was applied equally, or as equally as the times would allow. This made him a hero to many, but it painted a target on his back that was growing larger by the day. The events leading up to that fateful night in June began with a series of escalating threats. St. Clair wasn't naive. He knew the risks he was taking. Friends and family urged him to be cautious, to perhaps lower his profile until the political wind shifted. But Arthur wasn't built that way. He believed in the work he was doing. He believed that the law should be a shield, not a weapon. Unfortunately, in the woods of San Jacinto, the law was often whatever the men with the loudest voices and the longest rifles decided it was. On the night of the incident, St. Clair was traveling home. It was a routine he had performed 1,000 times, navigating the winding trails that cut through the thickets. The moon was likely obscured by the heavy canopy of the trees, leaving only the rhythmic clopping of his horse's hooves to break the silence of the forest. He had no way of knowing that waiting in the darkness was a group of men who had decided that Arthur St. Clair had lived long enough. This wasn't a random robbery or a heat-of-the-moment argument. This was an ambush, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. The silence of the woods was shattered by the roar of shotguns. Multiple blasts tore through the night, striking St. Clair and knocking him from his horse. He didn't die instantly. As he lay on the damp earth, the attackers emerged from the brush. These weren't masked strangers from a distant town. These were men who likely knew him, men who may have sat in the same rooms with him during county meetings. The brutality that followed was intended to send a message. It wasn't enough to kill the man. They wanted to destroy the symbol. When St. Clair's body was found the next morning, the shockwave traveled through San Jacinto County like a physical blow. The scene was gruesome. It was clear that he had been targeted with a specific kind of malice. The news didn't just stay in the county. It traveled to the capital in Austin and beyond. This was a direct assault on the stability of the local government. For the community that looked up to St. Clair, the loss was immeasurable. Their advocate, their voice, had been silenced in the most cowardly way possible. The investigation that followed was, as you might expect for the era, fraught with complications. While there were many who knew exactly who was responsible, there was a wall of silence that proved nearly impossible to breach. In a small community where the perpetrators held significant social and political power, speaking out was a death sentence. Witnesses suddenly suffered from lapses in memory. Potential leads turned into dead ends. The local sheriff's office found itself in a precarious position, caught between the demand for justice and the reality of local power dynamics. However, the pressure from the state level was mounting. Governor Richard Hubbard couldn't ignore such a high-profile assassination of a public official. He dispatched state agents and offered rewards for information leading to the arrest of the killers. This external pressure forced the local authorities to take action, leading to the identification of several suspects. These weren't outlaws living on the fringes of society. They were prominent citizens, members of respectable families who believed they were acting in the interest of their community by removing a man they saw as a threat to their way of life. As the legal proceedings began, the case turned into a circus. The courtroom in Cold Spring became a battleground for the soul of the county. On one side was the prosecution, backed by the state, trying to prove that a cold-blooded murder had taken place. On the other side was a defense team that didn't just argue for the innocence of their clients, but essentially argued that the killing was a justifiable political act. They leaned heavily into the racial and political prejudices of the time, painting the victim as an agitator and the defendants as protectors of the social order. The tension during the trial was so high that many feared a full-scale riot would break out. Armed men from both sides patrolled the streets. The atmosphere was so volatile that the trial eventually had to be moved. It was a clear indication that justice, in its purest form, was going to be difficult to find in a place so deeply divided. The legal maneuvers lasted for years. There were indictments, arrests, escapes from custody, and mysterious disappearances of key evidence. The St. Clair affair, as it came to be known, became a symbol of the lawlessness that could occur when political hatred was allowed to fester. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the fate of the suspects. While some were eventually brought to trial, the outcomes were far from satisfying for those seeking justice. In one instance, a key suspect was liberated from jail by an armed mob of his supporters, an event that showed just how little regard there was for the rule of law when it conflicted with local interests. Others managed to delay their trials indefinitely through a series of legal loopholes and the intimidation of witnesses. As the years rolled into the 1880s, the memory of Arthur St. Clair began to fade from the headlines, but it remained a festering wound in the heart of San Jacinto County. The political landscape shifted, and the Redeemers solidified their control. The goals that St. Clair had fought for, equal representation and the protection of civil rights, were systematically dismantled. In many ways, his killers achieved exactly what they wanted. They didn't just kill a man, They killed an era of progress. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the decades that followed, the story of St. Clair was passed down through the generations, often in hushed tones. To some, he was a cautionary tale of what happens when you challenge the status quo. To others, he was a martyr, a reminder of the high cost of courage. The exact details of who pulled the triggers and who gave the orders became blurred by time. But the central truth of the story remained. A good man was murdered for the crime of wanting to lead his community. In recent years, historians and researchers have returned to the piney woods of East Texas to dig through the archives and piece together the fragments of the St. Clair case. What they found was a story of a town at war with itself. They found evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local society. They also found a community that, for a long time, chose collective amnesia over the painful process of seeking the truth. The site of the murder is now just another stretch of Texas road, indistinguishable from the miles of forest that surround it. There is no monument there, no plaque to mark where Arthur St. Clair took his last breath. But his legacy lives on in the very struggle he died for. The story of his life and death serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of justice and the enduring power of those who are willing to stand up for it, even when the shadows are closing in. When we look back at the 1870s, it's easy to view it as a distant black and white era of cowboys and outlaws. But the murder of Arthur St. Clair reminds us that the issues were much more complex and much more human. It was a time of profound transition, where the old world was violently clashing with the new. St. Clair was a man of the future living in a place that was desperately clinging to the past. He was a man who believed that the ballot box and the schoolhouse were more powerful than the shotgun. The tragedy isn't just that he was killed. It's that for a long time, his story was intentionally forgotten. By erasing his name from the public record, those who killed him tried to finish the job they started that night in the woods. They wanted to make it as if he had never existed, as if his ideas had never taken root. But you can't kill an idea, and you can't truly bury the truth, especially not in the red clay of East Texas. Today, the name Arthur St. Clair is beginning to be spoken again. He is being recognized not just as a victim of a brutal crime, but as a pioneer who paved the way for those who would follow. His story is a vital piece of the American mosaic, a dark chapter that must be read if we are to understand the full scope of our history. It's a story of power, race, and the long, slow march toward a justice that is often delayed, but never entirely defeated. As the sun sets over San Jacinto County today, the pine trees still cast long, deep shadows over the land. The woods are still quiet, holding their secrets tight. But the silence is no longer absolute. The story of Arthur St. Clair has broken through, a voice from the past demanding to be heard, reminding us that even in the darkest thicket, the truth eventually finds a way to the light. Next story, the King of the Bank Robbers. New York City, 1878. In the late 19th century, New York City was a place of soaring ambition and staggering inequality. It was the era of the Gilded Age, where marble mansions rose on Fifth Avenue, while the slums of the Five Points festered just a few miles south. It was a time when man could be whatever he claimed to be, provided he had the right suit, the right accent, and enough money to grease the palms of the Tammany Hall machine. Among the elite social circles of the city, few were as respected or as enigmatic as George Leonidas Leslie. He was a man of impeccable breeding, a graduate of the University of Cincinnati with a degree in architecture. He was handsome, soft-spoken, and possessed an intellect that seemed to glide effortlessly through the most complex problems of structural engineering. To his wealthy neighbors and the members of his exclusive clubs, George was a rising star in the architectural world. But George Leonidas Leslie led a double life that would make the most seasoned fiction writer blush. By day, he discussed the aesthetics of the New York skyline. By night, he was the mastermind behind the most sophisticated criminal syndicate in American history. It is estimated that during his decade-long reign, Leslie was responsible for 80% of the bank robberies in the United States. He wasn't a thug with a pistol. He was a scientist of the heist. He didn't break into banks, he solved them. But in the early summer of 1878, the brilliance that had protected George Leslie for so long finally flickered out. His story doesn't end in a courtroom or behind the bars of Sing Sing. That it ends on a lonely, windswept spot called Tramps Rock in the Bronx, where a group of travelers stumbled upon a sight that would shock the city to its core. To understand how the king of the bank robbers met such a grisly end, we have to look at the meticulous, almost obsessive way he operated. Leslie didn't believe in luck. When he targeted a bank, he would first acquire the blueprints of the building, often using his credentials as an architect to gain access to sensitive documents. If blueprints weren't available, he would open an account at the bank, spending weeks visiting the branch, measuring the thickness of the walls with his eyes and timing the movements of the guards with a pocket watch. He would then do something truly extraordinary. He would build a full-scale replica of the bank's vault in a secret warehouse. He would practice the robbery over and over again in total darkness until his crew could move through the space with the precision of a Swiss watch. He invented tools, drills that could pierce through reinforced steel without making a sound, and little jokers, tiny devices inserted into combination locks to intercept the sequence of numbers that he was a ghost. For years, the police were baffled. They were looking for rough-hewn criminals, but they were being outmatched by a man who quoted Shakespeare and understood the molecular integrity of iron. However, even the most brilliant architect cannot build a structure that survives a rotten foundation. Leslie's foundation was his crew to pull off his elaborate schemes. He had to surround himself with the most dangerous men in the underworld. Men like Banjo, Pete Emerson, and the volatile Tom Draper. These weren't men of science. They were men of greed and violence. And in the underworld, loyalty is a currency that devalues quickly. The friction began with the planning of the Manhattan Savings Institution heist. This was to be Leslie's magnum opus, a score that would net them nearly $3 million, an astronomical sum in 1878. But Leslie was becoming distracted. He had always been a man of refined tastes, but those tastes had extended to the wives of his associates. Specifically, Leslie had begun an affair with the wife of Tom Draper. In the hyper-masculine, honor-bound world of 19th century crime, this wasn't just a personal slight, it was a death sentence. Draper was a man known for a hair-trigger temper, and as rumors of the infidelity reached him, the meticulously planned heist began to take a back seat to a plot for revenge. At the same time, Leslie's perfectionism was starting to grate on the crew. He was delaying the Manhattan Savings job, insisting on more rehearsals, more measurements, and more caution. The men he led were tired of practicing. They wanted the gold. They saw Leslie's hesitation not as brilliance, but as a sign that the professor was losing his nerve. On May 29, 1878, George Leslie told his associates he was heading out for a few days. He was seen leaving his boarding house, dressed in his usual finery, a silk hat, a tailored coat, and carrying a gold-headed cane. He looked every bit the successful businessman. It was the last time he was seen alive in Manhattan. 5 days later, on June 4th, a group of men walking near the Yonkers border found a body slumped against a massive boulder known as Tramps Rock. The body was in a state of advanced decomposition, ravaged by the summer heat and the elements. The IT was dressed in expensive clothing, but the pockets had been turned out. There was no identification, no watch, and no gold-headed cane. The initial investigation was bungled. The local authorities thought it was just another vagrant or a victim of a common mugging. But when the body was brought to the morgue, a detective who had been tracking the city's most notorious burglars recognized the fine tailoring of the suit. A few days later, George's brother arrived from the Midwest to officially identify the remains. The king of the bank robbers had been dethroned. The autopsy revealed a chilling detail. Leslie hadn't been killed at Tramps Rock. He had been shot in the head elsewhere, his body kept in a cool cellar for several days before being dumped in the woods. This was a professional hit, a message sent by those who knew exactly who he was. The vacuum left by Leslie's death was immediate. Without his stabilizing hand and his architectural genius, the crew he had assembled began to fracture. They eventually went ahead with the Manhattan Savings Institution robbery in October 1878. While they succeeded in breaking into the vault and stealing nearly $2.8 million in securities and cash, the job was sloppy. Without Leslie's plan for the getaway and the laundering of the bonds, the police were able to track them down with ease. Within months, the core members of the syndicate were behind bars. Tom Draper, the man most suspected of pulling the trigger on Leslie, was eventually implicated by informants. The story that emerged was one of a thieves' court. The crew had supposedly lured Leslie to a house in Brooklyn under the guise of a final planning session for the big heist. There, they confronted him about his affair with Draper's wife and his perceived cowardice in delaying the J.O.B. in the dark parlor of a nondescript brownstone. The man who had outsmarted the greatest financial institutions in America found himself unable to talk his way out of a bullet. They had executed him, kept him on ice, and then moved him to the Bronx to mislead the police about the jurisdiction of the crime. The murder of George Leonidas Leslie marked the end of an era. He was perhaps the last of the gentlemen criminals, a man who viewed crime as an intellectual pursuit rather than an act of desperation. After his death, bank security underwent a revolution. The vulnerabilities he had exposed, the flaws in the iron alloys, the predictability of the guards, the weaknesses in the combination dials, were systematically fixed. Architects began to design banks specifically to defeat men like Leslie. Today, Tramps Rock still sits in the Bronx, a silent witness to the end of the Gilded Age's greatest mastermind. George Leslie's name has largely faded from the public consciousness, overshadowed by the more flamboyant gangsters of the Prohibition era. But in the annals of true crime, he remains a singular figure, a man who built his life on the precision of a blueprint, only to find that the human heart is the one variable no architect can ever truly calculate. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a stark contrast to the marble monuments he had helped design for the city's elite. The millions he had stolen were never fully recovered. Much of it was in non-negotiable bonds that the crew couldn't sell or hidden in caches that died with him. George Leonidas Leslie spent his life breaking into the most secure places on earth, only to be left out in the open, discarded by the very men who had once treated him like royalty. The professor had forgotten the most basic rule of his own trade. You can have the best tools, the best plan, and the best intellect in the world, but if you don't trust the people standing in the dark with you, the vault will never truly be open. As the sun set over New York in the summer of 1878, the city continued to grow, its skyline reaching ever higher, built on the foundations of men like Leslie, some who worked for the light, and one who worked for the shadows. Next story, the unidentified drowning victim, Jefferson County, Colorado, 1935. We step far back in time now, into the high-altitude landscape of Jefferson County, Colorado, for a case that remained a profound mystery for nearly 8 decades before being solved through the precision of modern identification techniques. This is the story of a man who was lost to history in 1935 and finally reclaimed by science. The incident occurred on a cold day in October 1935. A body of a man was found in a remote section of the South Platte River, a major waterway running through Colorado. The man had drowned, and the body showed no immediate signs of foul play or external violence, leading authorities to categorize the death as accidental. The immediate challenge was identification. The man carried no wallet, no identification papers, and no personal effects that could immediately tie him to a name or family. He was a complete unknown, a person who had simply appeared in the river and could not be traced back to the local community or to the transient population of the Great Depression era. The authorities were meticulous in their documentation. They recorded the man's physical description, took fingerprints, and noted the clothing he was wearing, which was modest but well kept. Photographs were taken of his face and his hands, showing a man who appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s. Despite broadcasting the details and checking with neighboring jurisdictions, no one came forward to claim him. The man was eventually buried as a John Doe in the county cemetery. His case file, marked unidentified drowning victim, was archived, a silent, persistent mystery that represented an unresolved life. For decades, the case remained utterly cold. The papers yellowed, the witnesses passed away, and the man's identity was lost to the history of the Depression. The only thing that remained was the original documentation and the man's physical remains. The crucial turning point came in the 2000s when the case was reopened by the Jefferson County Coroner's Office, recognizing the potential of new forensic technologies. The body was exhumed, and investigators focused on retrieving a usable sample of DNA. The DNA analysis revealed a comprehensive genetic profile. This profile was submitted to law enforcement databases, but as expected for a death that occurred 70 years prior, there was no match. The investigation then pivoted to the emerging field of forensic genetic genealogy. The unknown man's DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases. This process involved working with genealogists to find distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry purposes. Through painstaking research and the slow assembly of a family tree built across several states, the investigators were finally able to narrow the search down to one family line. In 2012, 77 years after his body was discovered, the man was tentatively identified as Joseph Henry Loveless. Investigators then worked to confirm this identity. The search for a direct relative led them to a living grandson of Loveless. After obtaining a DNA sample from the grandson, the match to the unidentified drowning victim was confirmed. The identification of Joseph Henry Loveless was a remarkable achievement, but it opened a new, astonishing chapter of the mystery. Records showed that Loveless, born in 1870, was not just an unknown drowning victim. He was an escaped killer. Loveless was wanted for the 1916 murder of his wife, Agnes, who had been killed with an axe in Idaho. Loveless had been arrested at the time, but he had managed to saw his way out of the county jail with a makeshift saw and vanish, only to turn up 19 years later, drowned and unidentified, in a Colorado river. The original mystery, who was the unidentified victim, was solved. But a new mystery emerged. Did Loveless die accidentally, or was his past crimes still following him in 1935? Since there was no evidence of foul play, the official cause of death remained drowning, closing the book on an 80-year-old cold case and an even older fugitive case simultaneously. The case of the unidentified drowning victim is a striking example of forensic genealogy's power, resurrecting a man's identity and revealing a history that had been buried for nearly a century.